On the evening of 30 October 1796, approximately 120 African cultivators from the Boconigua plantation rose up in revolt with the alleged goal of killing the plantation's director Juan Bautista Oyarzabal and all the other whites. They succeeded in forcing Oyarzabal and his partisans to flee to nearby Santo Domingo City by setting fire to buildings and cane fields. These rebels were eventually routed by the forces of Santo Domingo's Governor Joaquin Garcia, who oversaw the capture of many of the insurgents and the execution of the ringleaders. Boconigua was the largest and most profitable plantation in Santo Domingo, the colony that later became the Dominican Republic. Concentrating principally on sugar, the plantation was coveted for its productive capacity by a succession of French authorities. The two most vivid and informative extant accounts of the rebellion frame the violence there as a slave revolt that bore many similarities to numerous other plantation uprisings in the Americas. Nonetheless, due to Santo Domingo's cession to the emancipationist French Republic in 1795, no human being on the entire island of Hispaniola could legally be held in bondage. Why did a self-professed champion of emancipation and equal citizenship bestow the highest praise upon Spanish political and military leaders for their swift repression of the revolt, while condemning the crimes that had supposedly been committed by the cultivators or ex-slave laborers in Boconigua? More generally, why do these two accounts of the insurrection make so little of the transformation of Dominican slaves into French citizens that Santo Domingo's transfer to France was supposed to bring about? On 22 July 1795, the Treaty of Basel ended a 2-year armed conflict between France and Spain. Article 9 of this treaty stipulated the formal cession of Spain's oldest colony of Santo Domingo to France. Due to the fact that the French Republic had decreed an end to slavery in all of its domains by virtue of its 1794 Edict of General Emancipation, it thus became illegal to hold other human beings in bondage in Santo Domingo upon the cession. Nonetheless, the reality was much more complicated. The cession created a political crisis of sovereignty concerning the condition, slave versus free, of the approximately 15,000 people who were claimed as slaves in the colony at that time. These ambiguities gave rise to heated debate among French and Spanish legal officials over the rights of these men, women, and children, which sparked disputes over the legitimacy of the institution of slavery itself. These debates, implicitly and explicitly, engage with the central question of the Haitian Revolution. Could or should a polity exist entirely without slaves? I will argue that these debates serve to illustrate that Santo Domingo became a crucial battleground in the political and philosophical conflicts over the terms and meaning of liberty and citizenship that transpired during this era. Scholars typically understand the Haitian Revolution as bounded by two major events: the massive rebellion that thousands of slaves in the French colony of Saint-Domingue carried out in 1791, and the foundation of independent and emancipationist Haiti in 1804. While the transformation of Saint-Domingue into Haiti involved protracted political, military, and intellectual conflicts, Santo Domingo underwent its own profound changes in this era. From the first time since Columbus laid the foundation for the institution of slavery on the island 3 centuries earlier, the colony of Santo Domingo experienced the prospect of a universal emancipation that would leave no individual enslaved there. While the evidence suggests that some forms of coerced labor persisted in Santo Domingo under French rule, some zealous French Republican officials, as well as free Dominicans themselves, tried to give meaning to emancipation that went beyond the stultified wording of a treaty signed in faraway Switzerland that merely implied the application of general emancipation. Despite the two accounts of Boconigua portraying it as a slave rebellion, the individuals on the plantation were, juridically speaking, free men and women who could claim certain political rights by virtue of coming under the rule of emancipationist France. Ferocious debates over these rights emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Treaty of Basel signing. Santo Domingo's cession in 1795 in fact elicited an impassioned effort on the part of some French officials to impose in that colony a benevolent regime that would achieve two goals: that of finally realizing the colony's economic potential and of imposing a more egalitarian political order in this slaveholding society. One such official was Philippe Rocheroom, the very same man who had pontificated about liberty while praising the Spanish officials who had suppressed the Boconigua revolt and executed many of its protagonists. In 1795, the French government designated Room as its particular agent and entrusted him with overseeing the transfer of that colony to France. In its instructions to Room, dated late 1795, the French government charged him with winning over our new co-citizens in a bid to curb emigration from Santo Domingo and secure the support of the political and economic elite. Were free Dominicans to be considered among these new co-citizens? These instructions contained a tortuous ambiguity on this matter. While condemning the horrible formal right of slavery of one man over another, these orders specified that French emancipation law did not constitute an infraction of the right of colonial property, except in the case of people who were blinded by vile interest. In treating the formerly freed population of Santo Domingo to refrain from abusing their freedom, these orders promised abundant land and other commercial advantages to Dominican slaveholders, who had suffered a real economic loss as a result of freeing their slaves. This timid defense of emancipation left space for claims making by both newly freed French citizens in Santo Domingo and opponents of abolition. Tied up in these uncertainties was a thorny legal question concerning the ability of Dominican colonists to emigrate with those whom they claimed as slaves. Could emigre colonists departing Santo Domingo after 1795 legally transport with them human beings whom they considered to be their property per the Treaty of Basel, which allowed Dominican colonists up to 1 year after the treaty's promulgation to migrate to another Spanish colony with their belongings? Or conversely, did the inhabitants, did the inalienable rights of these French citizens preclude anyone from claiming them as property, even in the case of flight to an area where slavery was still the law of the land? In a September 1795 correspondence, Room outlined this legal conundrum and sided with the anti-slavery position. Forcefully claiming that slavery constituted a violation of natural law, Room argued that as a civil right, property was inferior to the natural right of liberty. Naively expressing his expectation that Santo Domingo's inhabitants would rush to enjoy the benefits of the French Revolution, Room nonetheless anticipated a certain degree of conflict. In his words, the Spanish purported owner can say, "I want to transport my slave as one of my goods," and the would-be slave, for his part, could respond, "I want to remain here as I am a French citizen." Room proposed a backdoor solution to the problem. Simply tell the freed person that he or she could flee to Saint-Domingue and hide out there during the year allowed by the Treaty of Basel for colonists' emigration with their properties. Fear of freed Dominicans mounting such a bold defense of their rights possibly motivated colonists there to adopt a variety of strategies to protect their perceived interests. The epistolary and armed conflicts that arose in this context challenged the political and perceived moral basis not only of the enslavement of Dominicans, but also the concept of the slave society itself. In a 1795 report to the French executive leadership, the Vice Admiral Trougeot correctly predicted that due to their fear of the effects of the liberty of the blacks on their social and economic power, many Dominican colonists would try to flee that colony with their possessions, including their would-be slaves. This development would exacerbate what the Vice Admiral judged to be France's fundamental problem in Santo Domingo, that could only realize the inappreciable advantage that would accrue from gaining effective control over this colony when it had successfully compelled the black there to perform agricultural labor. In light of these concerns, Trougeot proposed the swift appointment to Santo Domingo of an agent of the Republic who would reassure its colonists that their fears of anarchy are misplaced. The rights of the formerly enslaved in Santo Domingo nonetheless became the subject of a spirited debate between the veteran French administrator Etienne Lavaux and Santo Domingo's governor Joaquin Garcia. As a self-professed apostle of liberty, Lavaux took Garcia to task for his perceived hypocrisy in freeing enslaved soldiers who had professed their loyalty to Spain during the 1793 to 1795 war with France, and then claiming Spain had not abolished slavery. To Garcia's assertion that preventing émigrés from leaving Santo Domingo with their alleged slaves would lead to the former's ruin, Lavaux's retort was simple: free soil trumped property rights. According to Lavaux, no individual could claim sovereignty, could claim another as his or her property in Santo Domingo from the moment that colony had legally come under French sovereignty. Garcia's response, dated 19 December 1795, drew upon the centuries-old Spanish-American practice of granting manumissions to certain individuals or groups for services deemed advantageous to the promotion of colonial or imperial objectives. Garcia argued that the liberties granted in the recent Franco-Spanish War were no different, and that individual emancipations did not in any sense imply an eventual end to the institution of slavery in an entire polity. By this line of argumentation, some people in Santo Domingo and other Spanish colonies would continue to remain in a state of perpetual bondage. In a letter to the Spanish Prime Minister from 12 days earlier, Garcia had presented slavery as the most useful and beneficial asset to Santo Domingo's colonists, and accused Lavaux of undermining the system by recklessly disseminating printed decrees about the general liberty of the blacks. Such actions could, Garcia fretted, incite unrest or rebellion in Santo Domingo's slaves. Behind this exchange was the central driving question of the Haitian Revolution itself. Could a polity exist entirely without slaves? For Lavaux, Garcia, Room, and many others, the efficacy of emancipation spread to Santo Domingo had implications far beyond that colony. The competing visions of a free society versus a land where some remained enslaved represented nothing less than a conflict over the viability of human bondage itself. Joseph Antonio Urizar, a member of Santo Domingo's Audiencia, or the High Appeals Court, recognized this. In a lengthy defense of the slave regime in Santo Domingo, Urizar engaged with the liberal ideas of the French and Haitian revolutions and sought to reconcile the power of these discourses with his own conviction that slavery must endure in his land. In his 25 June 1795 Discourse on the Modification and Limits of Slavery, Urizar urged his fellow Dominican administrators to adopt certain prudent and tactful measures so that the bad example and corruption of Saint-Domingue would not spread to Santo Domingo. Explicitly confronting the argument that no human being ought to be enslaved due to the right of peoples, Urizar responded that while all peoples concur that men by nature are born free, the exigencies of Spanish law, and especially of the material interests and property rights of slave owners, demanded that slavery be maintained. While Spanish and Spanish-American political thinkers had since the early 16th century grappled with issues concerning the rights of subject populations, Urizar confronted the libertarian discourses of the twin revolutions that had engulfed Santo Domingo. Many other colonists and authorities in Santo Domingo shared his concerns. According to a report issued by the French Civil Commission in Hispaniola to the French Minister of Marine from 1796, several colonists in Santo Domingo had presented to the Spanish king a request that the Treaty of Basel be annulled on the grounds that it would deprive these colonists of their properties founded on slavery. In an undated letter, Etienne Lavaux was even blunter. "The Spanish have put free Dominicans into slavery," Lavaux lamented. "They have put them under the torture of the whip, and they have rendered them even more unfortunate than before." Such assertions made a mockery of the naivete and wishful thinking of officials such as Room, who in a 5 August 1796 communique had declared that Dominican colonists all know that slavery is incompatible with our principles, and that one proclamation of amnesty to them was worth more than an army of 50,000 men. As these men and women sought a meaningful freedom characterized by equal citizenship and economic autonomy, officials such as Garcia and Urizar envisaged a more circumscribed existence for them. In this, they were joined by French Republican officials who, while pontificating on the virtues of liberty and the injustices of bondage, themselves strove to impose restrictions on the lives of these free Dominicans. In her examination of the transformations of Cuba from a Spanish slaveholding society into an independent nation in the 19th century, Ada Ferrer compellingly contended that the seeds of the revolution's undoing were present in the revolution itself. This argument can in many ways be applied to the case of Santo Domingo under French Republican rule. While the intransigence of Spanish officials and purported slaveholders there served to undermine emancipation, the racial authoritarian tactics, and often limited visions of the few authorities that the French Republic stationed there after 1795 also boded poorly for the lot of formerly free Dominicans. Perhaps nothing epitomizes this more than the case of Bocanigua. In Santo Domingo at the same time, French authorities were busy implementing coercive labor regimes that sharply circumscribed the rights of freed people there and sought above all else to ensure their continued submission to French rule. Room appears to have equated the Bocanigo insurgents with the rest of ex-slaves, whom he perceived to threaten French authority in Saint-Domingue. After all, the French regime could hardly expect to establish a profitable plantation society in Santo Domingo if it could not control the labor force on its principal plantation. In treating Bocanigo essentially as a slave revolt, Room and others of his ilk undermined the liberation that they professed to bring to this part of the island. While these political and philosophical debates suggested for the first time that Santo Domingo might transform itself into a land without slavery, this promise became undermined by the economic fixation on creating a profitable plantation economy in Santo Domingo, and by the political objective of the incorporation of Dominicans into a centralized French Republican state. Santo Domingo would ultimately have to wait until 1822 to experience complete and lasting emancipation. While these debates thus attested to the revolutionary potential of emancipation and equal citizenship in Santo Domingo, they also revealed some of the contradictions that led to their tragic failure to materialize in that colony under French rule. Thank you.